makes a determination about whether the school has met the performance criteria. Has it earned the right to keep going? And that is a core feature of charter. Interestingly, charter schools, while they may be granted all sorts of flexibility under state law, and charter schools, I should point out, as the gentleman said, there's only 8 states at this point that don't have charter laws. It's state law that gives you the right to do a charter school. There's no federal charter schools legislation. There is a piece of legislation that funds charter schools, but they don't create them. And so you can't exempt folks from federal law under charter school statute. There are some federal laws which factor the differences of charter schools in a little bit, but not a whole lot. All states charter schools law calls for health, safety, civil rights, and assessment to follow what the state does. I don't know that they all have to, but they all do. Charter schools can, in many places, start from scratch as brand new schools, and that is the impetus in a lot of places to have charter schools, because folks know that they have an innovative idea and they want to have a chance to implement it. But in many places, you can also convert from a traditional school into a charter school. In very few places, like New Jersey, you can convert from a private school to a charter school. But there's a concern there that maybe the folks who want to do that are really just trying to get a private program publicly funded. And the laws usually don't allow that. Speaking of funding, charter schools fund themselves through per pupil formulas. It varies tremendously by state. It's the kind of thing where if you do not know exactly how that formula works, it just sounds like a lot of gibberish. I know the formula in a couple different places, but it varies a lot. It piggybacks obviously on the existing state formula for overall public school funding. But basically, when a student transfers from a traditional public school into a charter school, the money, or most of the money, that will be attributable to that student comes with them. Sometimes conceived of as a kid with a backpack, and the money that supports him goes into the backpack. And if he walks into the traditional district school, it goes into the district school. If he walks into the charter school, it goes into the charter school. The caveat to that is the final bullet point here, which is that in most places, that backpack is not going to include funding for facilities. And so a lot of folks who parsed it out and determined that charter schools receive something in the neighborhood of 70% of the funding that the district schools get because of that limitation. There may also be other limitations, other kinds of funding in a particular state that the charter are not eligible for. But one way or the other, charters do represent a reallocation of resources from one kind of public school to another kind of public school. And my sense is that there's an appreciation of that in Kentucky, from what I have read, and that is a tricky issue. One thing we could drill a whole afternoon on is labor and charter schools and how those things line up, but I would just simply say that in most states, there are plenty of charter schools, if not all charter schools, where the teachers are not part of a teachers union. In some places it's required. In Maryland, you have to be part of the teachers union. In many other places, it's much more limited. Admissions are a big issue in charter schools, and how kids come to be there, how they come to enroll. Generally speaking, if there are more applicants than there are seats, you would hold a lottery or some other kind of mechanism for random selection. It may be, though, that it's not entirely random, because in most states that have charter schools, there are a number of mechanisms that weight more heavily students from a particular category, or that exempt those kids from that lottery. And the best example of that is the kids who are just returning from the previous year. If you're already in the school, you've got a seat for the next year. But it may also be that if your sibling shows up, and the sibling gets extra weight, maybe the siblings get in the lottery process before the general population gets in, because it's perceived that that's fair to the families who are already enrolled. Many states have a provision allowing for some way to measure whether we can allow local students, whether that's within 5 miles of the school or living within the school district, or some other measure that you can come up with, whether local kids get a priority to go to those schools. There are a lot of different factors. In New York, we have a provision that says that kids at risk for academic failure should be able to get a preference for enrollment in a charter school. And so the charter schools, if they can make a strong argument to their authorizer, if they want to say, for example, that we want to serve English language learners in particular, or we want to serve a particular category of special education kids, that we can construct an admissions process that would favor, more heavily weight those applicants over the general application pool. And if they were persuaded authorizer to do that, then they may be able to send that out. Again, there is a lot at stake. In Delaware, they have a rule that says kids who have a particular affinity for the academic program being offered get admissions preference. And I pointed out to them that that means you could have the yachting charter school of Rehoboth, where all the yachting families have a particular interest in that program, and therefore they're all going to get in. They did not change that provision. Once you accept the kids, you're likely to have a waiting list, and the idea would be to rank order that wait list so that as people are offered spots in the school, if they decline, then you can go to the wait list. You are not allowed to discriminate. It's a general statement, broadly true. It's a public school. The legal status of charter schools. Let's talk about that for a minute. Raise your hand if you're familiar with the term LEA. I want to talk to an education group. We know what an LEA is mostly. All right, so that the federal law, Federal Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which is No Child Left Behind, IDEA, which is the special ed law, they make distinctions between SEAs and LEAs. SEA is the State Education Department. It's a state educational agency. And back before charter schools, the second box was very problematic. It's the local education agency, which would be the district. So you have the state and the district, and it made sense to allocate responsibilities and authorities between those two things. But charter schools put a wrench in that. Which should the charter school be? Should it be an entity that has so much autonomy that it's treated under the law like a district is? And it matters a lot for special ed, because if you're the LEA, then you have to come up with a full placement, you have a full spectrum of placements for kids. That means every kid who can't say his T's and his R's, and every kid who needs a residential placement, because they can't have a less supportive environment, that charter school is responsible because they're the LEA. So some states have done that. Pennsylvania, for example, charter school is the LEA, and if they get a kid with severe autism and he needs to be in a private school program, then they're going to pay for it. Many states take the opposite approach. And in New York, for example, charter school is part of a district LEA. That means that it functions like another school that would be within the district. So if you have a problem, if you have a child who needs a particular service, you need to go to the district and say, we need to have the IEP team come together and address these issues. You don't convene the IEP team. And people sometimes ask me, okay, so which is the better one? And I say, kind of neither. The boxes don't line up very well to the reality of the way education has evolved. And I've been pressing for some change to this issue of what an LEA is and what the responsibilities are. It's possible that we could allocate those responsibilities and authorities in a more dispersed sort of way, but short story is, if Kentucky were to consider doing charter schools, it would need to decide what kind of legal authority that they have. I don't know I have an entire slide for this, but charter schools cannot be controlled or established by a religious organization, partly because of the Establishment Clause of the U.S. Constitution, but I've also seen reference to a provision in the Kentucky Constitution which says, so if that's what you came here for, you leave town in Kentucky. All right. Charter school started in 1991, and for a long time, what we thought about when a charter school was, we thought about these pioneer people who wanted to break away from this system and do this thing which had never been started before. A small school, a drop in the bucket, and led by people who had a passion for a particular approach to education. And that has morphed from that into a much broader sector where much of what's going on is the proliferation of networks of a single model. So they started a KIPP school in Texas and in New York. And now they've replicated that so much that there are probably, I don't know the exact number, probably close to 200 KIPP schools that follow that model in a whole bunch of different states. And increasingly, we see these networks as a source of the new schools being started. And frankly, as you would see from the Credo study, which was referred to before, those are probably the schools that do the best. I mean, I don't want to say there are not still standalone independent charter schools and ones that do a terrific job. There are. But now we're living in a world where there are these networks. And frequently when I talk to states that are considering expanding their charter school work, they want to know, how do we get those out-of-state networks to come here? Because there's an element, I think, of trying to bring in that which is already proven. Sometimes those organizations are not-for-profit organizations. Usually the term we use is a CMO, Charter Management Organization. Sometimes they are for-profit organizations called Education Management Organizations. Not why I couldn't get our lingo lined up on that, but that's how it plays out. I tend to use the term educational service provider as a blanket term across that. I just mean by that it's both of those things. Sometimes those organizations provide just back office services or a limited set of services. Sometimes they do absolutely everything. Everything across the board. Even if they do that, though, the school is still responsible for running itself. And that's an important point that I think sometimes gets lost. There's a charter school should be run by a board of trustees. Board of trustees effectively hires the company, but the company still reports to the board of trustees. In Ohio, where all things charter schools get kind of turned upside down, because the structure there is different than it is in many other places, there have been some of these management companies who said, no, actually, we own the school, and the board reports to us. There's been litigation over that, very tricky, not something that's part of Charter School 101. But for Charter School 101, the understanding I want you to have is that the board runs the school, the board holds the charter. The management company is essentially a vendor to that. An agreement, a charter agreement, is the fundamental document between the authorizer and the school. The charter is that we're going to talk about before. Lying on top of that is a management agreement or an operating agreement signed between the charter board and that vendor. So it sort of sits on top of the charter agreement, that's the fundamental one that allows for the school to exist, and this allows you to know how it's run. So let's go back and talk a little bit more about that charter agreement. I got too fast, too slow? All right? Yeah, well, I'm not too bad. So the charter agreement defines who does what. You have an authorizer, they're open for business, they're able to issue charters to groups that have a good idea. In all likelihood, the charter law will say that authorizer has the ability but not the responsibility to approve any particular charter application. And when they decide they want to go forward, they would issue a charter agreement, some sort of a contract which says, okay, we understand that we have the authority to do X, Y, and Z as the authorizer, and you have the responsibility to do 1, 2, 3 as a charter school. One fundamental thing that it should do is establish how good is good enough in terms of academic performance. Nobody should be in this work if they're not doing it to raise student achievement. And so it's very important to indicate what the expectation is. In New York, it used to be that all of the authorizers would say 75% proficiency is what we're looking for from a charter school if you wanted to get renewed. Now that's a high standard. It became an even higher standard when the Common Core kicked in. And all of the schools in New York dropped 30 or 40 points in the space of a year. And they were still signatories to a contract that said you're going to be at 75%. So that's created a little bit of chaos. It has not resulted in the schools being held to 75%, but it is difficult to factor in. So in that sense, it really could be considered to be a performance contract. It's not just a contract, it's a performance contract. Are you doing what you said you were going to do? If not, what do we do about that? Are we going to close you, or are we going to put you on probation? It should address three primary areas: academics, financials, and operations. And those are really the three main boxes when we talk about charter schools. Those are really the three areas of accountability. We talk about financials. Are they following proper audit procedures? Are they following proper money handling procedures? Are there any sorts of issues that come up with the way that they handle public funds? Because obviously charter schools are stewards of public funds. In terms of operations, how is the school run? Is it an effective entity? Is it operating in compliance with applicable law? Is it following the requirements of its charter agreement? All those sorts of things. And these should all be considered at renewal of the charter. In some states, an actual